Good Tuesday evening. I'm Chance Seals in Washington. This is Scripps News Tonight. In moments, an exclusive interview the political world's going to be talking about tomorrow. The former Vice President and likely 2024 candidate Mike Pence sits down with our very own Andrew Rafferty. No question is off limits.
Andrew, good to see you.
Mr. Vice President, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Of
course.
Take a seat.
We get his reaction to the ongoing debt cliff debate here in Washington, when and if he's entering the presidential race. And he's now opening up a bit about some differences with the man he calls his former running mate. The list of Republicans vying to best President Joe Biden in 2024 is growing by the day. Senator Tim Scott tossing his hat in the ring on Monday. Scripps News now confirms Florida Governor Ron DeSantis will announce his bid via Twitter tomorrow. And tonight, we're hearing from a potential contender who is quite familiar with the White House. We take you to the ever-important Midwestern political mecca, Des Moines, Iowa. For that is where we find Scripps News political director Andrew Rafferty tonight. Andrew, you wrapped up this exclusive sit-down interview with the former Vice President Mike Pence, his only national interview during this trip to Iowa. The conversation covered tons of ground, no conditions, everything up for discussion. I'm anxious to hear this. What did we learn?
Yeah, well, Chance, look, this interview came at a really interesting time for Mike Pence. You mentioned DeSantis getting in tomorrow, Tim Scott having gotten in yesterday. His advisors, his political team, are trying to figure out how Mike Pence doesn't get lost in the mix, because it's early, but it's not that early. Just about 9 months until those Iowa caucuses. That's why Mike Pence was here today talking about the issue that could be the driving societal issue in the Republican primary, and that is parental rights. But you'll hear he's very comfortable taking on President Trump when it comes to Ukraine, when it comes to government spending, certainly when it comes to January 6th. But how does he separate himself from this growing field? Tim Scott, Ron DeSantis, and the biggest question of all, which I asked him, when, if ever, does he officially get into the race? Mr. Vice President, thank you for joining Scripps News.
Thank you, Andrew. Good to be with you.
I want to ask about one of the reasons you're in Iowa, and that is parental rights.
Right.
It is an issue that's driving conservatives across the country here in Iowa, the idea that parents should have more access to their children's education, what they're reading, as well as conversations about identity and gender.
Right.
And so I'm interested to know, what do parental rights mean to you?
Well, you know, I'm a father of three. I'm the grandfather of three, and there are no more important rights, Andrew, than the right of parents in this country to make the most important decisions about their children. It's one of the reasons I'm so enthusiastic about what Iowa's done, what Indiana's done, and a handful of other states in extending universal school choice. I mean, now here in Iowa, as in my home state of Indiana, parents are able to choose where their children go to school, whether it's public, private, parochial, or even homeschool, and let the taxpayer dollars follow them. I think this is an idea whose time has come. It's an issue I've championed for many years, but I think in the wake of COVID, when many parents saw what their children were learning on those laptops at the kitchen table in real ways they hadn't seen them before, it enlivened the desire of parents around the country to take greater control of their children's education. And frankly, the radical gender ideology that's been advanced in many public schools, including here in Iowa, have been very troubling to parents. I mean, our foundation in Washington is involved in a lawsuit of a school district where literally here in Iowa, a student would be required to have a written permission slip to get a Tylenol from the health department at the school, but they could get a gender transition plan without ever informing their parents. And as a parent, as a grandparent, that's just not acceptable, Andrew, and it's one of the reasons we're pushing back, we're advancing parental rights, but I think ultimately letting parents choose where their children go to school is an idea whose time has come.
And I want to pick up on that idea, because if a minor, with their parents' consent and their doctor's consent, decides that gender-affirming treatments are something that they want to pursue, should they be able to do that without government interference?
Well, I support legislation in our home state and around the country that would prevent that. Andrew, look, you can't get a tattoo under the age of 18 in most states in the country, and this idea that that we would allow children to go through either chemical or surgical transition treatment really before they've come of age, before they have a full appreciation for the decisions that they make and the long-term consequences. So I've supported measures in my home state and around the country that would simply ban gender transition treatment for young people, and I think that's in our children's best interest.
Yeah, and I think a lot of Americans agree with the idea of not allowing minors to have access to stuff that cannot be undone later down the road.
Right.
But my question is more on the idea of hormone blockers, puberty blockers, stuff that is endorsed by major medical associations. If a doctor says that is safe, is a way to allow children to have more time to kind of figure out who their gender identity is that something that you would oppose as well? Do you think the federal government should oppose?
I don't think we do our children right by allowing them to make decisions until they've become fully formed adults. Look, my faith informs me that male and female, he created them. I don't believe there's multiple genders in America. I believe there's male and female. And I think what we're seeing, particularly in women's sports, is very troubling to Americans who agree with me, I think, in the vast majority, that participation in women's sports ought to be limited to the gender at one's birth, out of a sense of fairness and common sense. But this idea of allowing children to engage in either medical treatment or even surgical treatment before they've really come of age, before they become adults and have a real appreciation for the long-term consequences of the decisions. I don't think it serves our kids, and I don't think it serves our families.
There could be parents who are watching this who think, listen, if this is a decision I make with my child and our doctor, why does the government have any role in this? What's your message to that?
Yeah, I understand that. Look, I think it's always the role of the government to look after the health and safety of the American people, and minor children have always been a special category. We've always limited what children under the age of 18 are able to do, whether it's get a tattoo, whether it's enter into a contract, and even criminal law deals with minors in most cases in different ways. So I think there's justification for protecting our kids very, very broadly. And I think we can do that in a way that still preserves the broad mainstream of parental rights in this country.
The Trump administration banned transgender Americans from serving in the military. Is that something that you would try to reinstate? It was undone by Joe Biden nearly a couple days into his new administration, but is that something you would reinstate as president?
You know, look, I think we've got to focus our military on the mission of defending this nation, and anything that erodes what our military calls unit cohesion is antithetical to that. And look, if you're talking about an adult that goes through medical treatment, I'm a person that make their own decisions whether I agree with them or not. But I think we've always got to conform policies in our military to what is in the interest of an effective fighting force that's able to rise to the challenge of confronting America's enemies. And I just believe that the introduction of transgender soldiers in the military has not contributed to our readiness, and ultimately is a distraction. And I'd stand by the policies of our administration.
Okay, so you would reinstate that?
Oh, certainly. Look, I've got a son in the military. I've got a son-in-law in the military. What I want the military focused on is not politically correct politics. I don't like this woke politics that's taking place in the military today. We actually should be spending an awful lot more on national defense than we are today, Andrew. We ought to be providing our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Space Force the resources that they need. But also it's the training, it's the readiness, is to ensure that they're prepared for any challenge that comes to our freedom or to to the security of our allies around the world. And anything that erodes that, anything that takes an eye off that mission, I don't think is in the national interest.
Yeah. I want to get to the other reason why you're in Iowa, and that is the caucus is coming up next year. Scripps News has confirmed my colleague in Florida, Forrest Saunders, Ron DeSantis, getting in the race tomorrow. He's going to do it via Twitter. What's your reaction?
Well, it's a free country, and I respect the right of any American to step forward and vie for the highest office in the land. But for me, for my family, I can tell you, I do believe that different times call for different leadership. I really think that I'm proud of the record of the Trump-Pence administration. I was proud to run with President Trump, not once but twice. I'm not sure anyone could have defeated Hillary Clinton in 2016 other than Donald Trump. But I do think that different times call for different leadership. And, just as an American, whether we're involved or not, I'd welcome anybody to that debate, because I'm very confident, starting here in Iowa and in states around the country, that Republican primary voters are going to choose wisely. We're going to choose the right standard bearer who will take on the failed policies of the Biden administration at home and abroad. I mean, Andrew, Joe Biden and the Democrats, during their time of controlling Congress, have virtually bankrupted this country. They've weakened America at home and abroad. They've trampled on liberties. They've advanced a liberal left-wing agenda. And I think the American people are ready to get back to the policies that our administration was advancing. But I also think that they want to see a style of leadership that at least has the possibility of bringing the American people together.
And you've been critical of Governor DeSantis, specifically when it comes to the issue of Disney. We know he's going to run as a conservative who says he can win and has won. Do you have any concerns about his record as a conservative lawmaker and governor?
Well, no, look, I like Walt Disney, not woke Disney. And I fully support what Florida did in challenging a left-wing agenda for children under third grade. In fact, I'd like to see them expand that in the interest of families in Florida. But where I took issue several months ago was, as a limited government conservative, I don't believe it's the role of government to then essentially go after corporations that differed with them in the political process. Look, Disney opposed Florida on that parental rights legislation. The governor and Republicans in Florida prevailed. It was a victory for the people of Florida, and I think all parties involved would do well to stand down and move on and let the political debates happen in the political process. But I think it should stop there.
Well, this week we've got Tim Scott, we got Ron DeSantis tomorrow. People are asking, what is Mike Pence waiting for? What's the holdup?
Well, I have to tell you, we're always very humbled when people ask. I mean, I'm a small town guy from southern Indiana. I grew up with a cornfield in my backyard. My grandfather immigrated to this country. I mean, to have people talk about you for the highest office in the land is very humbling. But we've taken our time over the last few years. We've been listening to people all over the country. We've been reflecting on the challenges this country has faced. And look, Andrew, I think the country's in a lot of trouble. And I really do believe that it's incumbent on all of us that have the experience and the background to turn this country around, to reflect deeply on what role we might play. But I don't have anything to announce in Iowa this week, but I promise to keep you posted.
That was just part one of our exclusive sit-down with former Vice President Mike Pence. In moments, what he says about January 6th, why he's concerned about some Republicans' comments on Ukraine, and where he stands on the idea of defaulting on the U.S. debt, like Trump is supporting publicly if House Republicans have to make concessions. What's next? Welcome back to Scripps News. Tonight, we're hearing from former Vice President Mike Pence, who may soon join the Republican presidential field for the GOP nomination in 2024. In an exclusive interview with Scripps News political director Andrew Rafferty, the former VP talked about the growing GOP primary, the Disney versus DeSantis feud, and said if he were president, he would reinstate a ban on transgender people in the military, calling their inclusion a distraction. And that's not all. Here's part 2 of our interview.
I want to talk a little bit about foreign policy, because if you do get in the race, this could be a pretty big dividing line between you and the other top 2 candidates, if they're Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis. On the issue of Ukraine, how concerned have you been about the rhetoric from Donald Trump and DeSantis having to walk back DeSantis that it was a territorial dispute, Trump being unable to explicitly say that he thinks Ukraine should become victorious? How big of a concern is that for you?
America's the leader of the free world. We're the arsenal of democracy. During our administration, I'm proud to say that with what we invested in our national defense, we unleashed our military against ISIS. The strong stands that we took around the world, that Russia didn't even attempt to redraw international lines by force during our administration. They had done it in the 2 prior administrations, and now they did it in the Biden administration with the unconscionable and unprovoked invasion in Ukraine. And I think it's incumbent on the United States of America to continue to lead a coalition of the West to provide Ukraine with the resources that they need to repel the Russian invasion. And I have great concerns about voices in our party that have either been unclear or have tried to diminish what I think is a genuine threat to the cause of freedom. I mean, if we don't stop Vladimir Putin in Ukraine, I promise you, I've met Vladimir Putin. I've looked him in the eye. I've told him things he didn't want to hear. Vladimir Putin is not stopping at Ukraine if he overruns that country. And it would not take long for him to reach the border of a country that we would have an obligation under NATO to send our military in to contend with. I also think, Andrew, that by providing the Ukrainian military with the resources to repel and defeat the Russian invasion, we're going to send a deafening message to China, whose military provocations across the Asia-Pacific have been constant over the last 8 years, have been widening, and they've made their intentions about Taiwan very clear. But I think if they see the free world rally behind people fighting for their freedom in Ukraine, it would be the most effective way to restrain China's ambitions and contribute to a more peaceful world.
Are those comments from Trump, from DeSantis, are those disqualifying?
Look, that's up to the American people. Look, President's announced his intentions to seek office, and I understand the governor's about to announce his. But if we enter this race, I welcome the debate. Look, I'm a Reagan conservative. I believe in the Reagan doctrine, which, very simply put, was if you're willing to fight the communists in your country, we'll give you the means to fight them there so we don't have to fight them here. It's part and parcel, Andrew, of what brought down the Berlin Wall and resulted in the collapse of the Soviet Union. To abandon that approach now in the face of unprovoked Russian aggression, I think not only would fail to meet our obligations as leader of the free world, but I think it would ultimately fail in providing the kind of leadership that ensures the long-term security of the American people.
And now, Donald Trump did a town hall a couple of weeks ago. You may have heard about it, got some headlines. But in it, he said he did not have to apologize to you because you did, quote, did something wrong by certifying the election. So I'm curious, should January 6th be an issue in this Republican primary?
Look, President Trump is wrong. I had no right to overturn the election. I'll always believe, by God's grace, that we did our duty that day in ensuring the peaceful transfer of power. And I would expect that the President's position on that will be a fair topic of discussion, whether I'm in the race or not. But also, I have concerns about the president's shifting positions on foreign policy. I mean, President Trump's policy on Social Security and Medicare is identical to Joe Biden's. And Joe Biden's policy is insolvency. Look, we have a national debt the size of our nation's economy for the first time since World War II. And I think it's unacceptable for the president or for people that would aspire to that office to simply walk by on the other side of the road and leave that problem to future generations like my 3 granddaughters. I think we need to square with the American people. We need to tell them the truth about the debt crisis that we're facing and then offer common sense reforms. So if we enter the race, there'll be probably more than a few disagreements with my old running mate, and I'd welcome the debate.
Yeah. And on that topic, the negotiations going on in Washington over the debt ceiling, the president has been very clear, former president, that Kevin McCarthy, Republicans, should not negotiate. How difficult a position do you think that put Republicans in? Do you think that is helpful or potentially harmful to the idea of...
The Constitution requires that the United States meet the full faith and credit of our currency. We have an obligation to do it. But I commend Speaker McCarthy for taking this opportunity to make a down payment on fiscal responsibility. Look, the Biden administration has launched a gusher of spending that ignited the worst inflation in 40 years. And I think the American people are figuring that out. They're figuring that runaway spending and debt in Washington, D.C. is raising the cost of living and impacting the quality of their lives. And I think they're ready for leadership that will respond to that. Speaker McCarthy's doing that, but failure is not an option. I mean, this is where I differ strongly with my former running mate. We can't default on the debt of the United States of America, but I'm confident that if Speaker McCarthy will continue to stand firm for these common sense initial reforms for fiscal responsibility, that they'll ultimately prevail, because I really do believe at the end of the day that even Joe Biden understands that we've got to uphold the full faith and credit of the United States.
So it's okay if Republicans don't get everything they want. There should be some negotiation if it means.
Well, I supported Speaker McCarthy's decision to take Social Security and Medicare off the table in these negotiations. But look, with runaway spending in Washington, D.C., and the mountain range of debt we're putting on our children and grandchildren, the American people want to see this new Republican majority stand firm and deliver a down payment on fiscal discipline that can adjust on the margins. But at the end of the day, I'm confident they will stand firm, and I'm confident we'll find a way to pay the nation's bills.
And one last question for you, Mr. Vice President. Appreciate you being so generous with your time. I want to read you a quote from one of your supporters named Scott Reed. He's leading a super PAC to support you, and he said that part of his goal is to reintroduce Mike Pence to the country as his own man. People know Mike Pence, they just don't know him well. And so what is it that the country does not know about you? What is it that you need to be reintroduced to potential voters? What is it that you're trying to get out to people being here in Iowa, spending time in New Hampshire, South Carolina?
You know, traveling across the country after leaving office, Andrew, I have come to the conclusion that I'm well known, but I'm not known well. Most Americans know me as that loyal vice president standing beside the president. And I was always loyal to President Donald Trump until my obligation to the Constitution and to the oath that I took precedence. But those 4 years, I always stood with the president in good times and in bad. And what I've come to understand is that for many Americans, that's what they know about Mike Pence, is a loyal lieutenant standing by the policies of our administration. But the truth is, long before that, I was a leader in the Congress of the United States. I opposed leaders of my own party when they tried to double the Federal Department of Education. I led the fight against the Wall Street bailout as a member of Congress. I served in leadership in the Congress, and then I went home to Indiana, where we balanced budgets, passed the largest tax cut in Indiana history, doubled our educational choice program, and reformed health care in new and innovative ways that had never been tried before anywhere in the country. And so if if I become a candidate for president, one of my aspirations would be that people would not only know my story of public service, the totality of it, and the battles I've fought as a conservative in the House and State House in Indiana and as vice president, but they also know that at the end of the day, I'm a small town guy from southern Indiana, raised by a combat veteran, the grandson of an immigrant, somebody that grew up in a family that lived the American dream. And the passion of my life is to continue to do my part to make sure that that dream is available for every American for generations to come.
Mr. Vice President, thank you for your time.
Thank you. Good to be with you, Andrew.
Andrew joins us again from the ground tonight in Des Moines. Andrew, you covered tons of ground there. Pence, he dinged Ron DeSantis for using state power to go after Disney, as he called it, for disagreeing with the education law. Even when you guys were wrapping up there, he said, I've gone after my party. I've split with them in the past. A few times tonight, Disney, Ukraine, he said, hey, I'm in a different spot. Something like limited government. It is the past of the GOP. Is it the future? Because Trump and DeSantis, they've been really ready and eager to use government power.
You know, it's interesting, Chance. Pence was actually one of the first Republicans to publicly criticize DeSantis for his feud with Disney. We've seen a number of other Republicans get on that train since. Those comments were certainly farther than he had gone in the past few months. But for Mike Pence, I think he needs to carve out an identity. And you kind of saw it throughout that interview, really even getting into that last question, that who is Mike Pence? Well, people know he was a vice president. Being vice president is not necessarily an identity. Being the person who stood up to Donald Trump for January 6th, perhaps successful if he makes it to the general election. But we know Republican voters, caucus goers here in Iowa, in places like New Hampshire, South Carolina, they don't really care about that. And so
identity, yeah, back in 2016, it was Biden saying, I'm just like my former boss. And now Pence is not the guy saying, I'm just like my former boss. Yeah. And he's not declaring yet, Andrew. It's somewhat late. And he's out there saying, you know, here's who I am. I grew up with a cornfield in my backyard. I'm a simple guy. This is all very flattering. A classic aw shucks answer. But he has been in this game for so long. Is he buying time? What is the holdup?
You know, it's interesting because we've seen he's not a governor who has to wait for a legislative session to wrap. He's not a member of Congress who has to kind of work it out with the schedule of when they are in and outside of Washington. Mike Pence is essentially a free agent right now. He's been traveling the country. He's been here, a number of other places, spending a lot of time on the ground because he doesn't have a whole lot of other obligations right now in his professional life in terms of being an elected member, either a governor or a sitting member of Congress. So it is interesting. His team seems to be content with the idea that you don't need to be an officially declared candidate as long as you're spending time in these key states. But as we talked about going into this interview, the field is not shrinking. We're seeing other members get congressional endorsements. The only congressional endorsement Mike Pence has right now is his brother Greg Pence. And so at some point, you need to kind of build up that infrastructure and tell especially those donors, hey, I'm doing this. Give me some money. Help me get over the finish line.
The one more thing I wanted to ask you about is what you started with, Andrew, because I looked this up. When it comes to parental rights in medicine, it is legal for kids to get plastic surgeries, you know, a nose job or breast enhancement or something, if their parent signs off on it and the doctor's on board. But you talked about parental rights for a long time, and this has become a rallying cry for conservatives. And your discussion showed what I think are some complexities here of Pence supporting parents' rights on education or religion, but not necessarily on medicine, gender transitions. Are Republicans having to thread that needle? Are they successful at it with voters right now?
Yeah, look, we've seen in our own polling and some of the reporting that we have done that there is a growing sort of caution when it comes to allowing minors to have access to gender-affirming care. But you're right that I think a lot of people are going to listen to what Mike Pence said right there and say that how, on the one hand, are we talking about parental rights, but on the other hand, he said pretty bluntly that if you're a parent and your child wants to do this, your doctor wants to do this, and as a parent you're okay with it, the government still has a role in preventing you from getting some of that care. So I do think that'll be really interesting. I think for Republicans, we know that they like to see regulation. We've seen a bill signed in Florida and a number of other states along those lines, but it's going to be a bigger issue well beyond just the Republican primary. I think the general election, people will have a much different view than they might of voting here in Iowa, Chance.
A venue like this, wide-ranging, in-depth, that's when we really get clarity on where they stand. Great interview out there. Andrew Rafferty tonight coming to us from Des Moines with this exclusive. Have a good one.